Hi everyone, thanks for joining our carbon border adjustment and climate waivers meeting today. We are just letting everyone join. I'm going to give it another 2 minutes and then we'll start. Okay, I think we'll get going. So if we can take the holding slide down, that would be great. Then we can see who's speaking. So welcome to our session on carbon border adjustment mechanisms and climate waivers, something that I'm sure many of you will have heard about if you've been looking at trade recently. We're really pleased to have an excellent panel with us who Shaun is shortly going to introduce. But I have two jobs, which is first of all to tell you about the logistics. This is the 6th of our briefing series on climate change and a range of other issues. There are 2 more to go, so please do check that out. This is a webinar, so we won't be able to see or hear participants. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. The session is being recorded and we'll be posting it online later. So I am pleased to introduce our chair for today, who's Shaun Spiers, the Executive Director of Green Alliance, which is a think tank and charity focused on leadership for the environment. Shaun is the former chief exec of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and from 1994 to 99 also served as an MEP for the South East. Shaun, over to you to introduce our speakers.
Great, thanks, Ruth. As Ruth says, we're exploring carbon border adjustments and carbon waivers. I think everybody recognises there's a pressing need to decarbonise, and the sooner we do it, the better for the planet. But there is also every country now has its own net zero commitments, and there's a danger that as we pursue our own national policies, we're going to understate the impact of our own consumption and export and offshore our emissions. So we'll be exploring today how trade policy can support decarbonisation and how we can ensure that free trade deals, investment agreements and WTO rules don't lock us into a hazardous climate trajectory. The last 2 briefings organised by TJM dealt with trade and fossil fuels and the interaction between trade policy, agriculture and climate change. As Ruth says, this session focuses on 2 new policies on the trade scene that, if adopted, promise to improve the climate impact of trade and trade deals. Carbon border adjustment mechanisms are designed to prevent companies moving production offshore to escape carbon taxes, and climate waiver clauses are the idea that the WTO should permit trade policies that advance the cause of decarbonisation. And I probably grotesquely simplified both of those, but fortunately we've got an expert panel that is going to explore these questions in detail. What are the climate impacts of trade and trade policy, and could these mechanisms reduce those impacts? What will be the effect on the global south when they export to the global north with these policies in place? And is there a risk of greenwash? So I'm going to introduce our panelists all together and then ask them to speak for I think 8 minutes, we said, or certainly up to no more than 10 minutes, please. And then hopefully there'll be a good lot of discussion in the Q&A box. And also, I can't remember if Ruth mentioned this, but do tweet and follow TJM on Twitter as well, so we can get the most erudite Twitter thread going on all this. I was going to say we've got 4 great panelists. Unfortunately, Jerome Mayhew, MP who is going to talk about the UK or Parliament's Environmental Audit Committee's report, is unable to be with us. There's some pressing debate this afternoon in the House of Commons, which is detaining him. But I'm really pleased we got who's going to speak first, Dr. Thilo Schäfer, Head of Research of the Research Unit for Environment, Energy and Infrastructure at the German Economic Institute. And Thilo is going to explain what CBAMs are and how they fit alongside other trade policies. And in my first U-turn of the afternoon, I'm actually going to just introduce Thilo, and then I'll introduce the next two speakers. So Thilo, you'd like to give your presentation.
Yes, thanks very much, Shaun. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to talk a bit about what the European Union's approach to this instrument CBAM is. So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, in short, you probably heard about it, is basically addressed at the import of carbon-intensive products. So what has the EU Commission planned here? It's initially planned to include just the basic materials sectors such as cement, aluminium, iron and steel, fertilizers, electric energy production in this mechanism. It's supposed to start in 2026, and the main goal is that the producers and importers alike will have to pay the same CO2 price. Along this new measure, the existing measure against carbon leakage, that is basically the free allocation of the certificates from the EU ETS, the emission trading system, that is free for particularly energy intensive companies that compete internationally with non-European enterprises. That will gradually phase out, and it should be replaced by CBAM. So if you ask, for example, French Minister for Economic Affairs, Bruno Le Maire, I think he's called, for him, this new mechanism is a victory for European climate policy. That's what he said. And he says it's a tool to speed up the decarbonization of our industry, and it's designed to protect the companies from countries with less ambitious climate goals. He even says it's designed to accelerate Europe's energy independence. Okay, so my main question, which I want to discuss with you, is: will this work like this, how it's supposed to be? So the CBAM, as introduced by the European Commission, is supposed to prevent the relocation of the production of carbon-intensive products from the EU to other countries. And of course, it's also supposed to prevent more imports of those carbon-intensive products. And if we look on the European internal market, this border adjustment mechanism, as planned right now by the European Commission in its Green Deal, it really can create a kind of level playing field between European and non-European competitors, because they all have to pay the same CO2 price in the EU internal market. So this means that CO2 intensive products will become more expensive in the EU. And it depends on whether the higher prices can be passed on to the customers. So the cost for the companies that process these raw materials, for the customers of those basic material producers, the cost, of course, will rise. This is the higher CO2 price. They actually create a stronger incentive to avoid emissions for manufacturers in the European market. It might also create a revenue, a budget for the necessary technology investments. However, at the same time, there are risks of adverse effects because such basic materials are not only produced for the internal market, but also exported in other countries. And of course, these will be more expensive as well. And if we look at the customer level of those basic material industries, for them, the attractiveness to relocate outside of Europe increases, because there they don't have to pay the higher prices for CO2 in the European Union. There are some more problems like, for example, the verification of the CO2 content of the product, if it's more complex, for example, or another risk is the resource reshuffling in those countries that export their basic materials to the European Union. If you look at China, for example, of course, there are some very low emission plants as well, and they could export their low emission products to the European Union and keep their high emission products to themselves, for example. And of course, especially when you look at trade policies, there's the risk of countermeasures. If you look at countries that are affected by these new European import levies, they could, for their part, react with import duties themselves and thus create additional direct competitive disadvantages for European export-intensive industries, those industries who are directly affected by CBAM as well as others who aren't. The WTO conformity is supposed to be given when you, if you ask EU Commission members, but I think it's not absolutely clear. So it could certainly be justified with the climate protection argument, but the countermeasures can be clarified probably in legal disputes. So the legal uncertainty prevails for now, and the tariffs will have to be paid at first. So there's the risk that the WTO rules are not necessarily recognized by all trading partners of the European Union. So many risks and unclarities, I would say, and that's the reason why many European companies, especially in the future CBAM sectors, fear that those measures will not be able to ensure the same protection that they have right now with the current regulation, with the free allocation of ETS certificates. So maybe I can say a few words about how these risks might be addressed. So there are a couple of ideas how to address, for example, the customers of those sectors. You could extend the CBAM to the entire value chain. So the downstream value chain can also be part of the CBAM, of course. Then the complexity is rising, of course, to verify CO2 content and so on. And you will have to include exports as well. So there can be some kind of export rebates or reimbursement of allowance costs when you are exporting products. Then, of course, you have the risk of resource reshuffling inside the European Union or the companies as well. So this comes at a cost again. And there's a strong case of many companies in those CBAM sectors. They want to maintain the free allocation. And there's an idea to combine that with a CO2 related product tax. I think it's a good idea in theory, but we also have to look at the sharp decrease of the EU ETS emissions cap due to the more ambitious climate protection targets, and this will reduce the scope for free allocation of certificates. So something must change here, and I think that's the reason why the EU Commission tries to introduce this new instruments and phase out the free allocation. There are, of course, other instruments who can go along with the CBAM, like demand stimulating instruments. I think it's important that there are not only the higher prices due to the CBAM regulation for climate-friendly produced raw materials, there's also the demand and the willingness to pay for those climate-friendly produced goods. And there are, of course, policy measures to help pushing through these higher prices, and policy measures that provide incentives to reduce the CO2 intensity. One last point which is also already addressed by the European Council, is to step up on international cooperation, because first of all, greenhouse gas emissions have a global impact. So it doesn't really help to relocate emissions or reduce emissions at one place and no changes at other places. So there's a strong case for international measures. And if you look at the challenge of reliably verifying the emission contained in the products, the important products, I think there's a need for common rules on reporting CO2 emissions, on the delimitation of those emissions. I think it's inevitable in the CBAM, and so that might be a good start to step up on the cooperative climate policies. I think that's already more than 8 minutes, so I'll stop here and leave the rest for the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Tilo. That was fascinating. Thank you. If I can just ask a quick follow-up.
Yeah, sure.
The Environmental Audit Committee in the House of Commons was very concerned about the impact of CBAMs on the cost of living, which is the big political concern at the moment. Has that debate caused European EU policymakers to go cold on this idea, or is that, or are they ploughing ahead regardless?
As far as I see the discussion, they're planning ahead, and there's I think the French presidency of the European Union right now really try to push this forward and push it through. And of course, it's, if you look at other countries that have CO2 price regimes as well, I think there's not such a big problem, because those it's only the price differences that would be part of the CBAM. Oh, yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, we can return to this, and a reminder to put questions in the Q&A slot, and we'll pick them up afterwards. So thanks, Tilo. The next speaker is Rashmi Banga, who is a Senior Economics Affairs Officer at UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And Rashmi, I think you're going to talk about the climate waiver.
Yes, thank you very much, Shaun. I will be talking about climate waiver, but also the impact of CBAM, because of which climate waivers become very important. Let me begin by saying that we all know international trade provides livelihoods, generates real income and employment for a large section of population in developing countries. And climate adaptation is also a very urgent agenda for developing countries. So decarbonizing international trade is important for developing countries as well. But what developing countries need for their environmentally sustainable transformation of trade is finance, is green technologies. They need capacity building. They need incentives for environmentally sustainable export diversification, and they need adequate policy and fiscal space so that they are able to design national policy so that they can progress on both their climate goals as well as other sustainable development goals. But what we are seeing is that initiatives like CBAM will make the progress of developing countries towards their climate goals even more challenging. Let me give you 3 reasons why CBAM can adversely impact the progress of the whole world towards their climate goals, as well as why CBAM is unjustified at the current juncture. Now, first of all, if you look at OECD, there is estimates by OECD that international trade contributes only 27% to the global carbon emission. Now that means the majority of carbon emissions can be tackled by national policies, and international trade policies will play a very limited role. And coming to international trading rules, the role of these rules will be even more limited. And this comes out very clearly from UNCTAD's estimates on the impact of CBAM. If you look at the study done by UNCTAD, what we find is that CBAM will reduce global carbon emission by not more than 0.1%. But the distributional impact of CBAM is going to be huge. According to the report, I will be putting the link of the report in the chat. According to our results, real income, the global real income because of CBAM will decline by $3.4 billion. Real income in developed countries will rise by $2.5 billion, and it will fall by $5.9 billion in developing countries. So the distributional impact of CBAM is going to be huge, which will make it very difficult for developing countries to progress on their SDGs, which includes the climate goals. Now, there will be many countries impacted because of CBAM. Their export competitiveness will be impacted, and we know that 7 industries have been identified by EU as polluting industries, and these include most of the industries where developing countries have their key exports, including textile and clothing, footwear, petroleum, coal products, chemicals, fertilizers, cement, glass, steel, ferrous metals, aluminium, and electricity. So a large number of developing countries will be impacted. Even LDCs will be impacted because of the existing global value chains. Now, this brings me to the second reason why CBAM is unjustified. We know that we are living in a global value chain era, and we also know that what has happened in the global value chains is that carbon emitting production activities have been outsourced to developing countries, while the lead firms are controlling the low carbon emitting activities like branding or financing. So energy efficiency of the North cannot be delinked from energy inefficiency of the South. So the profits that lead firms are making are at the cost of the carbon emissions that are being done by their production activities in the South. So we really cannot say that CBAM is justified and the developing countries should pay a price for their carbon emission. And the third reason why CBAM is not justified is that if you look at, in our trade and development report of 2021, we have looked at the OECD data on carbon emission, and we have found some very interesting facts. Let me share 3 of them with you. The first, if you look at the share of OECD countries in total carbon emission, which is embodied in their global gross exports, it is 31%. That means in the global exports, the carbon emission share of OECD countries is 31%, while non-OECD countries minus China is only 16%. If you look at the per capita carbon emissions, we know that they have fallen in OECD countries, but they are still much higher than non-OECD countries, including China and India. And third, if you look at the carbon emissions in gross exports of OECD countries to non-OECD countries, they have grown much faster than their imports from non-OECD countries. So to say that, to give level playing field to European producers, CBAM is justified, I think this is grossly mistaken. Now, what can be done at the WTO to address this issue, to also help developing countries to decarbonize their international trade? We are advocating a positive trade and environment agenda in the WTO. Now, this positive trade and environment agenda should include facilitating patent-free green technology transfers, having additional finance being made available to developing countries so that they can bear the cost of environmentally transformation of their international trade. There was a proposal by China and India in 2011 on trade and for creating a trade and environment fund. I think this proposal needs to be revisited. Then another thing that can help is building technical capacities of LDCs and SIDS so that they can set up their climate smart infrastructure. This can be done also by providing positive incentives, not punitive actions, but positive incentives at the WTO. For example, there can be a preferential market access given based on progress towards nationally committed goals. There could be positive incentives like zero tariff regime for plastic substitutes, or let's say a more relaxed tariff regime for renewables and their substitutes. It is also important at the WTO that there is adequate policy and fiscal space for developing countries for designing their trade policies that also fulfill their environmental agenda. And over here, we think that climate waivers can play a very important role along with the peace clauses. So there could be a limited climate waiver so that there are no trade-related disputes challenging the environmental measures of developing countries. Now, this will give confidence and assurance to developing countries, and they will be able to put in place policies that can be development friendly as well as prioritize their climate goals. For example, some policies can be put in place for transition to renewable energy, for green procurement, and for green jobs program. We know that developed countries are already following these policies, but these could be challenged at the WTO. With an army of lawyers that is available, with developed countries, they can justify these policies. But for many developing countries and LDCs, it will become extremely difficult to justify these policies. So climate waivers or peace clauses at the WTO can be initiated so that these countries have the confidence and they can move ahead with their national policies designed both to progress towards their sustainable development goals, to get more, to use trade as a vehicle for development, as well as to progress on their climate goals. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rashmi. Really clear. Can I just ask just a quick point of clarification? If the alternative, if the positive measures were in place regarding finance and technology transfer, etc., would there be a role for CBAMs, or is it an either or? You just don't want CBAMs, however they're whatever other policies are in place.
Because like I mentioned, CBAM is kind of a punitive action, because this is going to adversely impact the export competitiveness of developing countries. It will reduce real income of developing countries. It will reduce global real incomes. So as a result, this will have an adverse impact on climate progress towards climate goals. So instead of CBAM, what is needed is positive incentives. And WTO can play a very important role in providing positive incentives for developing countries to transform their environmentally sustainably transform their trade.
Great, thanks. Really clear. Thank you. So final speaker, and we're getting some questions in the Q&A at the moment, which is great. Katie Galogli-Swan is policy coordinator for the joint project between UNCTAD and Boston University on supporting a green and just transition of the world economy. And I think, Katie, you're going to propose ways for a climate and trade agenda that can work for sustainable development. Katie.
Thank you, Shaun, and thank you to the trade justice movement for having me here today. I am in some ways going to be echoing a lot of my colleague Rashmi's comments. We come from the same team, so that will be unsurprising, but hopefully adding a bit of a political economy analysis of where these conversations are arising from and potential ways forward to a more positive agenda. So I'm going to share screen. Can I see a thumbs up, Shaun, if you can see my screen okay? Thank you. So our trade deal is going green. Where is the evidence of this green trade? So as has already been mentioned, we have the European Commission adopting its communication on the European Green Deal. And one of the key measures within the Green Deal is the proposal for a CBAM for selected sectors, as other speakers have already explained. We see this CBAM proposal popping up in other regions, Canada, the UK, but also in the US. The The office of the new USTR, Catherine Tai, said in the annual policy report that it would consider carbon border adjustments as appropriate and consistent with domestic approaches to reduce US greenhouse gas emissions. And this has emerged recently also in the developments of sectoral deals like the EU-US Green Steel deal. These sectoral deals are designed to try and drive extraterritorial decarbonisation as well as domestic decarbonisation through the trade regime. And then lastly, we're also seeing these outside of more free trade relationships or bilateral relationships. In the multilateral regime, we're seeing the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions progressing at the WTO. Now, this is a plurilateral initiative, which at the moment is missing many developing countries. 71 countries, I believe, are participating. And the work plan for 2022 is focused on environmental goods and services, circular economy, fossil fuel subsidies, and climate-related measures. So there's some concerns just to quickly raise and to sort of build on the numbers that Rashmi was providing. You know, for example, with the steel deal, one of the main critiques that we're hearing is that, well, it's all fine and well choosing a sector that you might have disproportionately better sort of emissions to prioritise, but what does that do for a sort of multilateral process? And similar with the Test D discussions, you know, if developing countries have lost trust in participating in those, and if that means that they're designed to, you know, disadvantage the comparative advantage of developing countries, then is that a multilateral method to sort of achieve both climate and development goals? As an example, you know, the liberalisation of environmental goods and services in the current list would reduce the domestic resource mobilisation of developing countries in the billions of dollars every year. And we know, you know, for example, that the circular economy is in some ways a recycled debate, which has already been rebutted by many developing countries in its current design and formation as a way of locking those countries into sort of the offcuts from advanced economies when they are exported into developing contexts. So there are some major shortcomings to the CBAM approach as a multilateral response. You know, to run you through less of the numbers and more of the sort of the design at the multilateral level. You know, it's potentially disproportionately punitive to the South, where access to advanced economies are fundamental to maintaining positive balance of payments. So there's this unequal power that is leveraged in these dynamics. There's an amnesia for the historical offshoring and locking in of carbon-intensive and extractive industries in much of the world, not least through colonialism, as Secretary General Guterres spoke about yesterday, actually. It ignores the intellectual property barriers to accessible, affordable, greener technologies and the advantage that advanced economies have in securing this. It doesn't challenge the power of multinational companies in the way that they move money across borders to access lower regulation and choosing that sort of market-based over a regulatory approach that would try and rein in the power of the big firms and the monopolies. And its design could be a recipe for a new commodity export dependence, with high value added concentrated in a few advanced economies and leaving the rest of the world to pay rents for green technology IP to the north. In other words, the CBAM approach is likely to have no sensitivity to the development challenge and prioritises domestic interests over a global multilateral approach to tackling climate change. You know, and as has already been mentioned in Thilo's presentation, you know, one of the main priorities or the main objectives is to try and tackle carbon leakage. You know, so this is a big concern for advanced economies, where industry moves to other regions of the world with more flexible environmental climate policy to benefit from cheaper production. You know, so this G7 focus on leveling the playing field. But this has been central to advanced economy climate progress. You know, offshoring their emissions gives the appearance of lower domestic emissions without considering their consumption emissions. And this has led to overconsumption in the north, where ever cheaper goods are necessary because of the downward pressure on wages in these economies. Which brings me to, you know, the real origins of this sort of new green protectionism, from a political economy perspective, it could be considered that they're actually more political. If they're not delivering, if CBAMs are not actually delivering significant emissions reductions, and they're not actually, achieving some of the stated goals, then what is it about? And a political economy perspective might say that, this is responding to the domestic pressures and crises of labour, crises of deindustrialisation, the fallout of hyperglobalisation in the last few decades. The ambitions are to onshore jobs, shorten supply chains, build local and regional resilience, at the same time as decreasing emissions and nudging others to do the same, which sounds great, but the current approach, this approach that is being taken forward, is also poised to prioritise securing lucrative positions within new green supply chains for green technologies, and it essentially reassembles the current global division of production, including the persistent underdevelopment and inequity we see in the world today. This beggar thy neighbour zero-sum approaches isn't a way to be able to sort of hold back further trade tensions or trade disputes and conflicts in the coming years. And this takes me to the way that a lot of this green trade or climate and trade initiatives are being framed. It's being framed around a sort of green innovation race. Indeed, across like the political spectrum, more and more people are posing tackling climate change as an opportunity, whether that's for growth or whether that's for equity, but it's led to a strategic pivot to developing the low and no carbon technologies that are necessary to transition, and which will be fundamental to future energy generation. And this has meant a new focus on industrial policy and pioneering technologies, which is dependent on fiscal space for public investment, and therefore there's a strong advantage for this in advanced economies. But one other thing to consider is that this is also dependent on prioritising mineral and extractive supply chains, which is politically and geographically challenging in regions like the EU. There's limited access to these minerals in their own territories, and politically difficult to build a new domestic extractive industry. So there is a dependency. There is, there is a dependency on a globally cooperative approach to the climate and trade agenda, and indeed to global transition. And it's important within this to recognise that there is a geopolitical and security dimension to some of these conversations. In February 2021, Biden issued an executive order saying that climate considerations will be an essential element of US foreign policy and national security. Around about the same time, after Antony Blinken was appointed, he said that the US must lead green energy revolution to combat China. Just this week, where the International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings are happening, and we're hearing from Janet Yellen about friendshoring, about creating new global economic governance regimes built on who your friends are. And understandably, there is a lot of pressure in the multilateral system right now about where we go next, considering the global conflict situation. We've also seen the US Competes Act, which is, has been interpreted by some as it includes both sort of domestic industrial policy for green technologies, but also specific anti-China initiatives as well. And we're seeing these emerging and alternative Belt and Road initiatives, Global Gateway from the EU and the Build Back Better for the World from the US. So, and even in the green steel, again, this is specifically framed in a geopolitical way. We can also forget that this is another area where these tensions and these policies are arising from. And one thing I would want to bring attention to is that a lot of this is underpinned by double standards. An analysis late last year of pandemic response across 6 countries showed, and essentially looking at, what did countries do to respond to the extraordinary crisis of the pandemic, and how much of those policies interacted with or came into conflict with their commitments, whether in WTO rules, whether in free trade agreements, whether in investment treaties. And it showed that all 6 countries took measures that came into tension with their trade and investment commitments. But of the countries studied, the US took the most trade measures, 476, and the China the least, 32. Now, that number 32 should be caveated with the fact that that might be because some of their measures were already in place before the pandemic began, and also maybe some lack of data. But it isn't this idea of a level playing field that some are breaking the rules and some aren't. I think is at best, a relaxation of the truth, and at worst, a double standard. The reality is that existing global rules did constrain many of the potential pandemic policy interventions that were catalogued in the study, including subsidies, tariffs, government procurement, and export restrictions. And we're already beginning to see, to go from the pandemic to the climate, which is the pandemic is a good example to think through what it would look like in the trade regime for these sorts of climate measures. We're already seeing evidence of potential climate and trade conflicts on the horizon. Just a couple of weeks ago, the EU initiated a WTO dispute complaint regarding UK low carbon energy subsidies and local content requirements. So, taking this one country first or beggar thy neighbour approaches without having a more multilateral way of moving forward with this, we might begin to see lots of these tensions which gridlock and cause policy chill for some of the climate initiatives that do need to happen. The reality is that all countries are going to need to use these tools, but these should be calibrated to the different needs of different regions. And I think I've went way over my time, but just quickly to go through some of the images and that I'm sure many on this call have already seen, we can't divorce that idea of calibrating to needs from the reality of climate inequity. At the global level, we know, this famous champagne glass image that the richest 10% are responsible for around about half of global emissions. We know that per capita emissions are concentrated in the advanced economies and the petro states. And we know that historically, the responsibility for the most emissions comes from the advanced economies. But we also know that rejecting trade and climate initiatives outright is not a realistic response to the climate crisis. We do need to align these different policy agendas. But trade needs to be a tool to deliver on ambitions, not just for climate, but also for strengthening development outcomes, creating jobs, and raising standards. This should be delivering regional resilience rather than dependency and extraction. And we should be avoiding at all costs trade-offs between economic development and climate justice. So what does an alternative vision look like? I think it needs to start by putting the principle of common but differentiated responsibility at the centre of these discussions on climate and trade. Common but differentiated responsibility in the climate world, it would be CBDR, is the core principle that some countries are more responsible for the climate crisis than others, and some have different capabilities to be able to respond. So I think there's sort of three basic pillars to a CBDR approach to a climate and trade alignment. First of all, removing the trade and investment barriers that exist that prevent climate action, expanding incentive-based policies to drive new action and to ratchet in achieving climate goals, and support with transition financing for developing countries. That's a non-negotiable. It will not happen if that financing isn't there. So what could that look like? What are some of the ideas that are floating around for a more positive trade and climate agenda? Asymmetrically expanded policy space should be baked into trade and climate initiatives. What does that asymmetry? It means that countries that are poorer or are still in the global south should have more space than advanced economies for their climate measures. South-South cooperation to build regional resilience, diversification, and climate and development strategies. We need more countries working together to learn from one another. We need technology transfers, or we could be thinking about open sourcing key technologies as public goods. Again, to use the pandemic as an example, the WHO initiated a COVID technology access pool that invited vaccine originators to contribute their technology so that it could be open sourced for any manufacturer to use. That access pool was ignored, but imagine how different the pandemic could have looked like if it had been used by the major pharmaceutical companies.
Katie, can you wind up quite soon, please? Thanks. So we get time.
No problem. Sorry. As Rashmi mentioned, voluntary preference schemes for achieving climate milestones, withdrawn from the ECT and peace clauses on ISDS in investment treaties. We need new, regularly replenished financing instruments. And we need complementary domestic mechanisms. Like Rashmi said, a lot of the emissions reductions that we're looking for can happen at the domestic level. And they should also be baking in equity at that point, tackling elite carbon emissions like frequent flyer levies and luxury goods taxes. I will stop there. thank you for your patience.
Great. Thanks, Katie. There's a lot there. Fascinating presentation. We've got not many questions in the Q&A. We have got just over 10 minutes, so do please put your questions in. But there's one question specifically to Rashmi, which is from Liz May in the chat. Are you suggesting that a climate waiver at the WTO be limited to developing countries? And I guess an extension for that might be whether there could be a case for calibrating CBAMs for developing countries so they have lesser obligations, which maybe I'll pose to Katie or Thilo. But Rashmi, do you want to take the climate waiver question?
Okay, so the climate waiver should be for all countries, but definitely for developing countries, given the structure of the WTO, where you have special and differential treatment for developing countries. So what I'm suggesting is climate waivers is needed by all countries. So even the developed countries should argue for climate waiver, but it should be definitely in place for developing countries. And if you are talking about the grand bargain, I would just like to say that we already have climate negotiations going on in UN, FCC. And then we also know that there is a climate finance which is being promised by the developed countries to developing countries, but there is a growing climate finance gap over there. So if you have that situation, then what makes us expect that in the WTO, the grand bargain will really pay off for the developing countries? And I think, again, we should not put the cart before the horse. It has to be first the climate finance comes in so that the developing countries can use that climate finance to transform their international trade. And then you can think of using the trade as a tool for addressing climate goals. But it cannot be the other way around. You cannot adversely impact export competitiveness and then say we will give you money so that you are able to transform your trade. Thank you.
I don't know if anybody else wants to pick up on that. There are a few more questions coming in. Katie, really quickly, and then I'll get on to the other questions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's what we have to be aware of is preference erosion, so there is a need for all countries to be able to mount climate strategies which are going to come into conflict with their trade and investment obligations. But how we do that asymmetrically to make sure there is expanded space for some countries and complementary measures like financing is how we make sure that preferences aren't completely eroded, so that our attempt to expand policy space actually just enables the preference for the flexibilities only for the richest economies.
Thank you. So there's a question here from Chris Morgan of KPMG. Thilo, I think I'll address this to you. If CBAM only applies to raw materials, could it actually drive higher end manufacturing out of the EU so that finished goods could be imported without a charge? Or do the panelists think the companies would not take the risk in case CBAM was expanded further down the supply chain?
Yeah, thanks. I think right now this is a worry that the producers of higher end manufacturing inside the EU actually have. They say that's why they need to be included. I'm actually not sure if after this introduction period of the CBAM, which is supposed to start in the next couple of years, that might be the case that it just starts with the raw materials and then gets expanded. So yeah, but still there's a chance, I think, for producers outside the EU here as well. I can agree with a lot what Rashmi and Katie said before about that there's a need for a wider approach, and CBAM is first of all a protective measure. Of course it is, but I think it's also important to see to maybe compare it with the actual situation where those raw material producers are basically not part of the ETS regulation because they get free allowances. So they do not have very strong incentives to reduce emissions right now. And that's going to change because of the new legislation. And CBAM is a measure to avoid that those companies just say, okay, then we leave the EU. So I think there's a real reason for this, but of course the CBAM as such, not included in wider policy measures that you suggested, is rather short-sighted. I agree on that.
Great, thank you. There's a question here from Roger Manser, which might, I guess, be for all of you, but he asks, where are the alternatives that Katie spoke about being developed? To be effective, they need to be discussed widely, COP, WTO, etc. And I would say the same for the solutions that Rashmi was talking about. Is this sufficiently on the agenda, or have the positive measures been displaced by developed worlds and the EU's, the UK's enthusiasm for the CBAMs? Rashmi, do you want to have a go at that first?
Well, as far as I can say, the positive measures have not been there, are not there in the WTO. And what we are saying that is, it is very important for positive measures to be taken up by the countries in the WTO. We do not have any positive incentives like zero tariff regime for substitutes or renewables. We do not have any. In fact, the plurilaterals which are coming out are more in terms of trade liberalization agenda, which are really forwarding the trade liberalization agenda. Just to give you an example, if you look at the trade and environmental agreement on trade and environmental goods and services, if you look at that agreement, the OECD list of environmental goods, if you look at that list, 60% of the products in that list are from those 7 industries which have been identified by EU as polluting industries. So on one hand, you say these industries are polluting industries, but on the other hand, you want to liberalize trade in those products of the industries, especially, and if you look at, we've done an analysis and we found that most of the products, it is the developed countries which are the net exporters of those products, while developing countries are net importers of those products. So what is happening at the WTO is that there are punitive actions, there are trade liberalization agenda which is being pushed, but positive incentives are totally missing.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you, Katie. I'm going to pose a different question to you. So it's from anonymous attendee, and it quotes the opinion expressed by Professor Dieter Helm, influential UK economist in the Environmental Audit Committee evidence. You have a development problem and you have a carbon problem. You need 2 policies, not 1, because you have 2 different problems. I don't think you do favours by exempting countries from facing a carbon price on pollution that we're causing by consuming their goods, simply because you cannot come up with a serious development package. What would you say to that?
Thank you, Shaun. I mean, I would first say that, in many respects I agree, but I think then the question is, what is the CBAM the answer to that? Because if the CBAM is not reducing emissions substantially, then it's not, it isn't the effective strategy to approach the carbon problem. And the development problem and the carbon problem are fundamentally interlinked. They can't really be separated. And I understand, we don't want a scenario where the majority of the world is locked into fossil fuel heavy development pathways, because we know that that will be more expensive down the line. But the issue here isn't one of not having the right policy. It's about having the multilateral cooperation that would be fundamental to tackle the development problem and the climate problem together. And to sort of reference the other question from Roger about where these alternatives are, I would argue that some of these are not going to happen within the WTO arena, because these are within a broader architecture of the sort of financing for development challenge. And especially some of these initiatives are things like South-South cooperation has long existed. It's just that is going to be a more dependable and will need further investment. And there are financing mechanisms. We have ODA, we have climate finance, but the issue is that if that countries aren't meeting their obligations or commitments. 2 years ago, this is from doing presentations last year, 2 years ago, if all G7 countries had met their ODA commitments, there would be $151 billion more in development finance. We know that advanced economies haven't met their climate finance commitments. We know that, you know, the IMF released a historic financing boost, liquidity boost to the world last year with $650 billion worth of SDRs released. The majority of that, more than 270 billion of that, went to advanced economies, while only 21 billion went to the least developed countries. We have this fundamental imbalance which prevents a sufficient multilateral process which can tackle the development and carbon challenges together. I don't think a punitive method, however, is a way to do that.
Great, thanks, Katie. Thilo, you wanted to come in. I think that might perhaps be the last word because I'm afraid we're out of time.
Okay. Oh, I would have liked to ask my co-panelists 2 questions, but I just wanted to say I absolutely agree on the last anonymous here who said that CBAM is not designed to solve all these problems. It's only addressed on the European market, and as such, of course, doesn't help that much to reduce emissions worldwide, but rather push through effective CO2 pricing in the EU, which is not happening for now. But there's also the idea, and the European Council emphasized this, to talk about other instruments linking European ambitious policies with other policies, like, for example, as you mentioned, Katie, the Green Steel deal between EU, US, and I would like to ask you, is this from your perspective, the way forward maybe? Or is it the climate club, Rashmi? Is this a positive incentive, or which are criteria? If you can take part in a climate club or a climate pro part of the WTO, for example. So there need to be incentives, as you said, for a positive approach, and of course you have to somehow show that you want to be part of this advanced climate part of the WTO.
Great questions, Thilo. I'm not sure we got time for answers, but Rashmi, covered really quickly. We've got about 1 minute, I'm afraid.
1 minute. You say that you don't want to consume goods produced by countries which are emitting, which are polluting, but you want to produce in those countries which are, which are polluting, because CBAM is to address the carbon leakage. So, and also given the global value chains, these are the countries which are producing because of the lead firms who have outsourced their production into these countries. And CBAM, why it should be addressed? Because it is a trade-related measure, and therefore it should be addressed in WTO. But other measures like climate negotiations, should be outside the WTO, because international trade does not contribute as much to the global emissions as the domestic production does. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm so sorry we haven't got time for more of the questions, and I think we've only scratched the surface. Katie, there is a request to have your excellent presentation put in the chat if you want to do that, and the recording of this session will be available on the TJM website. I hope we'll be able to return to the discussion. It strikes me that the discussion on CBAMs in the UK, for all the excellent work done by the Environmental Audit Committee and others, hasn't been quite as rich and as joined up with development policy and so on as it should have been. But I also take Thilo's challenge that they're not attempting to do everything, and we need to find ways to solve the kind of overwhelmingly serious climate crisis that the world faces, and this may be one way, certainly worth considering. But thank you to Katie, Thilo, Rashmi, thank you to TJM, thank you to everybody who's participated, and I hope we'll see you at the next one of these sessions. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.